Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about Moody's downgrading the United States credit rating. The US really seems like a poor bully, still swaggering around everywhere. In addition, China is fighting. There's already a precedent with Xinjiang cotton. American companies that purchase Chinese magnets are complaining, saying that the Chinese side is strictly reviewing approvals and they can't get their goods. After China and the US reached a preliminary tariff agreement, the US stock market soared. Trump temporarily forgot about China and went to the Middle East, bringing in what was claimed to be $3 trillion in investment for the US, and as a result, he got himself a super large private jet. This time, it looks like the US has made a huge profit. So, as long as Trump doesn't pick China, this tough opponent to mess with, there are still plenty of places around the world where he can squeeze out profits. However, after Trump returned from the Middle East, the US didn't seem particularly confident when it once again came face to face with China. On May 15th, Li Chenggang, China's Vice Minister of Commerce and Diplomatic Representative, met once again with US Diplomatic Representative Greer during the APEC meeting in Seoul, South Korea. The two sides once again discussed Sino-US trade issues. This was their first meeting after the talks in Switzerland. However, it seems that no major agreements were reached. It was likely preparatory work for substantive negotiations in the future, setting the agenda for upcoming discussions. After both China and the US mutually lowered tariffs, Chinese suppliers have resumed shipments to American retailers. However, due to urgent demand from the US side, the requirement for large volume shipments has directly driven up shipping costs. Additionally, due to the uncertainty surrounding tariffs, Chinese suppliers are taking a cautious approach toward long-term orders coming from the US. They're mostly thinking about getting through the back-to-school shopping season at the end of summer first and then deciding what to do next. In other words, even though there has been a temporary compromise on tariffs, the fundamental relationship between China and the US cannot return to what it was before the trade war. After the release of the China-US-India-Asia statement, a new round of competition between China and the United States has already begun. The US has started to restrict Huawei in the field of AI chips, urging the world not to use Huawei's AI chips. Meanwhile, China's battleground lies in rare earths. Since China has not lifted its export controls on rare earths, American buyers are becoming increasingly anxious. According to a South China Morning Post report on May 16, rare earth export controls are a trump card in China's hands, and the United States will find it difficult to shake off its dependence on Chinese rare earths in the short term. American companies that purchase rare earth magnets from China are worried that, as China strictly controls export approvals, their material inventories for production lines may run out. This could lead to supply chain disruptions and potentially trigger catastrophic financial consequences. An American company that claims to produce non-sensitive commercial audio equipment is extremely concerned. This company wants to purchase magnets containing trace amounts of regulated elements from China for its factories in Europe and Latin America. Because China's current export control material approvals require at least 45 working days, and the Chinese government demands that buyers provide a guarantee stating the products do not contain controlled elements, this company's overseas assembly lines are now at risk of running out of magnet inventory. In a statement, the company said that delays in export approvals will disrupt their production and also negatively impact downstream car manufacturers who purchase their automotive audio systems, potentially causing production stoppages. If these issues remain unresolved for an extended period, they could trigger catastrophic financial consequences, including a sharp drop in revenue and a chain reaction of supply chain disruptions. Since China implemented rare earth restrictions, this unnamed American equipment manufacturer claims to have already sent representatives to China to follow up on the permit approval process. The company has even requested support from US officials to help engage with the Chinese side and resolve the issue of delays in product documentation. Reuters previously reported that since the restrictions took effect last month, China has issued export licenses to at least 4 rare earth magnet producers, including suppliers to Germany's Volkswagen. In a briefing on May 14th, Beijing-based consulting firm Trend China analyzed that the market has misunderstood the meaning of the recent licenses. These approvals were granted before an agreement was reached between China and the US, so they do not indicate that lowering tariffs will trigger a policy shift in China's rare earth controls. Moreover, the licenses issued by China only cover customers in Europe and Vietnam. In other words, China has not approved rare earth exports to American companies. This American manufacturer also said that an application submitted by one of its suppliers in Beijing in early April has already been approved for a shipping license. This license allows exports to Europe, and at the very least, this lets them know that the Chinese side is processing applications and following the procedures. However, sources familiar with the company said that the complexity and restrictiveness of the approval process mean that even if approval is granted, the process is still quite lengthy. The challenge is that each license only applies to a single shipment, and in just the past 2 weeks, they have had dozens of shipments. The company disclosed in internal documents that, in order to ensure their inventory, they have resorted to taking desperate measures. One of their magnet suppliers attempted to airship goods for export without the required license, and they actually managed to clear customs successfully. However, when they later tried to ship by sea, the goods were intercepted and inspected by Chinese customs because the magnets did indeed contain controlled critical minerals. The supplier has since stopped making such attempts. Roberts, a non-resident senior fellow at the American think tank Atlantic Council, believes that China is unlikely to relax its export controls on rare earths. He said that China holds a dominant position in this field, and this may be one of the key ways for China to exert influence over the United States. Now they are using export controls on rare earths to punish the US, and they will not discard this weapon from their economic and trade arsenal. China's recent special campaign to crack down on the smuggling and export of strategic minerals also suggests that export controls are unlikely to be relaxed in the future. It can be summarized as follows. First, China requires US importers to provide a guarantee that their products do not contain controlled elements. In fact, this requirement for importers to prove their own compliance is something the US has already implemented for a long time. In 2011, after the US announced a ban on Xinjiang cotton, Japanese clothing retailer Uniqlo exported a batch of men's shirts to the US, which were seized by US customs. The reason was that the US had already banned the import of Xinjiang cotton and related products. Officials suspected that these shirts came from the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is on the sanctions blacklist. Although Uniqlo denied this, they still had to find evidence themselves to prove their innocence. Other US businesses importing duty-free goods have encountered the same situation as Uniqlo. So, in fact, the US is the originator of this system of proving compliance with certificates. Second, if China and the US fail to reach the next stage of agreement, American military-industrial companies will likely no longer be able to obtain Chinese rare earth products, and US weapons production will face major problems. So just looking at the anxiety of American companies today, you can see that China really does have a yellow card to play. But the US faces more than just one problem, doesn't it? Due to the continuous increase in US government debt, Moody's downgraded the US credit rating after the market closed on May 17th, lowering it from the highest AAA rating to AA1. This landmark decision has cast doubt on the United States' status as the world's top sovereign borrower. Previously, Fitch and Standard & Poor's had already downgraded the US rating below AAA. Moody's decision means that the United States, the world's largest economy, has now been downgraded by all three major rating agencies. It is also foreseeable that the US has been constantly pressuring these rating agencies not to downgrade its rating, but in the end, even Moody's went ahead with the downgrade. Moody's stated that this downgrade reflects the fact that the ratio of US government debt and interest payments has been rising continuously over the past decade or so and is now much higher than that of other sovereign nations with the same rating. The agency also said that multiple US administrations and Congress have consistently failed to reach an agreement on measures to reduce the annual fiscal deficit and interest expenses. They believe that the fiscal plans currently being discussed in the United States could achieve substantial reductions in mandatory spending and deficits over the coming years. It is expected that over the next decade, as compounding expenditures in the US continue to grow while government revenues remain steady, the fiscal deficit will further widen, and both government debt and interest burdens will keep increasing. Moody's report states that over the past decade or so, US government spending has continued to rise, while tax cut policies have further weakened fiscal revenues. As deficits and debt continue to expand, rising interest rates further drive up the government's interest expenses. Moody's believes that if the US does not adjust its tax and spending policies, the flexibility of the US budget will continue to be severely constrained. If the Tax Cuts and Relief Act proposed by the Trump administration in 2017 is extended under the current administration, it will add an additional $4 trillion in structural deficits over the next decade, and that doesn't even include interest expenses. This is also Moody's baseline expectation. Therefore, Moody's expects the US federal deficit to expand from 6.4% of GDP in 2024 to nearly 9% by 2035, that is, in 10 years' time. This is mainly due to increased debt interest payments, compounding interest expenses, and slower revenue growth. In addition to being downgraded by Moody's, the US debt problem is already on the brink of disaster. According to a report by US media on May 15th, the US Treasury received $30 billion in US Treasury bond buyback proposals at that time, but for various reasons, Treasury Secretary Yellen only accepted $4 billion worth of bond buybacks. To put it plainly, the market doesn't trust US Treasury bonds, so large investors are asking the US Treasury to buy back the bonds they hold. The proposed buyback amount is actually only $30 billion, which is a small figure compared to the current total US national debt of nearly $37 trillion. But the US Treasury ultimately accepted only 13.3% of that amount, and this sends a very serious signal. It simply means that the US could only come up with $4 billion in cash for the buyback. considering that nearly $6 trillion in short-term debt will mature in June. The US Treasury will need to issue new debt to pay off the old, making this the most severe test in the history of US Treasury bonds. To sum up simply, first, the US now looks like a terrifying monster weighed down by debt, yet still swaggering around everywhere. Even Moody's has finally accepted reality and is preparing to downgrade the US credit rating, which basically confirms that the US no longer enjoys high creditworthiness. If you lend them money, you need to be more cautious. Second, the US is actually quite weak. When Trump took office, he continued the tax cuts from 2017 and even wants to further cut payroll taxes. He tried to use forced tariffs to grab money, but that hasn't gone smoothly. Now, as China watches him struggle on all fronts, it naturally isn't afraid to strike back hard.